almost upon us, and they are expected to change a lot of things at the ground level in our towns, our cities, our villages, everywhere. Good evening and welcome to Face for the Newsfirst team. I'm Niresh. With me this evening is someone who needs little introduction. She is Vraie Balthazaar, representing the NPP, who became quite famous over the last several years with all the work that she did during the Aragale and of course during the election campaigns. Welcome, Vraie.
Good evening, Niresh. It's good to be back.
Right. So, Vraie, let's dive right into it. Local government polls. What is going on? How is the NPP preparing for it?
Well, I think on our end, we've been preparing for multiple elections. So there's no special preparation, but we also know that there's, I think perhaps with people, a question on when this will happen. There was initially a conversation about it happening in March, but now I think we're looking at perhaps end April. So there is a discussion. I think a lot of that will be decided maybe in the course of the next week and a half with what goes on in Parliament. So on our end, we are very excited about the tangible things that we can do on the ground. We know that there's been a presidential and then a general election, and we're still I think there's a lot going on kind of on a national level, right? But I think what people can feel tangibly is what happens on the ground, issues that are pertaining to whatever is in their neighborhood, their environment, the community. And I think in some sense, it is a local government election that will be able to address some of those concerns. So I'm personally also very excited about what we can do for the city. And I think as NPP, we are really doing what we've been doing all this time, which is continuing to engage and to work and to ensure that we keep our promises.
Now, has the NPP decided on its nominees throughout all these hundreds of councils?
So I think within the district, in particular Colombo district, we had most of us who ran at the previous local government election 2023, who were the leaders for our areas. For instance, I ran from Colombo City and I was a candidate from Colombo City. Most of my comrades have actually moved up into Parliament, leaving a void and leaving room and space for new leadership. I, despite having run for the general election, I didn't make it to Parliament, and therefore I am in the city. So I am looking forward to continuing the work that we've been doing all this time, and I'm hoping the city will also make that choice with us.
Right, but have the nominees' names, are they known now among the party?
We will have I think once the election dates have been fixed and that process has been fixed, we will then declare our nominees officially. But of course, I think, Niresh, for the longest time, we've been working on the ground. So a lot of our community leaders who are now our candidates will continue to be will continue to work and move on, kind of continue to move on.
Right, and for the important, I mean, all councils are important in a sense, but for the most important ones, the municipal councils, have the mayoral candidates been decided?
For the better part, yes.
Right. And is it you for Colombo? Because you were earlier.
I was earlier. And I think Colombo will possibly still work with me. And I'm, like I said, very excited about what we can do for the city.
Lovely. Now, tell us what you've been doing since the last election, because that was the last time I saw you, just I think before the general election.
About a week and a half prior to election, the end of the election at least.
Yes, and you've been busy, I know. What you've been doing?
Sure. So I think post-election, there was always, I mean, there was a lot happening on national level. We obviously, not for me personally, but obviously for the party, it was a time of transition, which I think in some sense it still is, a kind of moving into those spaces and ensuring that we had the right teams in those ministries, in those departments, in these various spaces that we now had power in. For me, I think I had asked in particular with the party also to continue working in the city, because this is really truly where my heart has always been. It is where I've worked as a researcher. It is where I know people the best also. So we've continued to work in the city. I think a lot of it initially was going back, the NPP won all 5 electoral seats in the city. It has never happened before. In fact, for the presidential election, we only won 2 of the seats, which is Beira and Colombo West. And I think it was, for us, not so much of a shock considering the amount of work we had done on the ground. But to be able to win Central Colombo and North Colombo was a huge, massive win for us. And I think to be able to go back and to engage with people, because despite having won, we also needed to be able to engage again. So a lot of our work in the last 2 months in particular has been to go back to each electoral seat, to open up offices so that we can have continuous conversation, to ensure that people's problems can be sent to the correct places, the correct departments, the relevant ministries, and to also listen to people's grievances. So we have public days, and I think in each constituency we want to be able to engage. This is what we had promised, that we are not here just for an election to show face and then we disappear, because I think that's generally the issue people have with politicians. And I think that's a stigma that we really wanted to break. So a lot of my work has been engaging on grassroots level again, at public days, and then more recently also looking at, not just the micro level problems, but also macro level problems in the city, such as waste. I was just telling you before we started recording that Beira Lake, for instance, is a massive issue.
That is a terrible mess. Our office here at Newsfirst is not very far from it, so I happen to go by there every day. And this is the heart of Colombo. This is a touristy area. We need that cleaned up, but as long as I can remember, it's been a stinking mess. So why is that, and what are you doing about it?
Sure. So the Beira Lake was made by the Portuguese in the 16th century, a long time ago. And it is, as a man-made stagnant body of water, it certainly comes with many issues, because over time people have, as it's not just that people are coming and dumping in garbage. That is not really the problem of the Beira Lake. Instead, it has multiple sewage lines and drainage lines that connect to the Beira Lake, and it's massively problematic, because a lot of this has been, I think people have been trying to resolve it over years, multiple governments, but I think it requires, and I think this is something that the NPP is trying to do now, or at least the government is trying to do now, not just the NPP, but through our mandate that the people have given us now, our government is trying to ensure that there are multiple stakeholders that come in trying to resolve this problem. So you have the CMC, you have the SLRDC, which plays a huge role in actually managing that body of water. You might have seen kind of flowers and different plants growing on Beira, which is also a part of them trying to aerate water. You have actual aerators in the space, and I know the temple is involved, the Gangarama temple. Then you have private organizations that are also plugging in and ensuring that the city it's not just a beautification project, but looking at it in a more wholesome angle. And also for us, it was very important that we also found a way to plug in community, because a lot of people's livelihood still around the lake, from the floating market area to the Gangaram area, there are communities that still, for that body of water is still very important to them. I don't know how many people still know this, but the Beira Lake, there are 54 fishing families that catch, I don't know what the English term is, but batto. They're small kind of fish. And they release 50,000 bato to the Beira Lake, I think twice a year. And then they cast nets and catch it. And so these fish that people consume, they eat. So you want that lake to be
all the more reason
not
for
just
it to be
not just
spotlessly clean,
exactly,
yes.
not just kind of superficially beautiful on the outside, but something that is that is a healthy space for all of the Colombo's wildlife and nature to continue to thrive in. So I think that's something that's also really important for us. But we know that not one entity can manage this alone. To try to find different ways and different entities to come together to try to resolve this problem. And I think therein lies a solution. And not just doing a one-off cleaning, but also maintaining it in the long run. So it's a huge challenge. But as you try to approach one problem, as with everything in the city, you then kind of go back and then say, okay, so this could be a sewage line problem, but the sewage lines are 110 years old. They are also quite derelict. They're falling apart. Then one step behind that, how do we resolve this issue? So there's no kind of easy way out. There's no looking at it and saying, okay, this country did this, this country did this. Certainly learning from best practices from other countries, but how do we ensure that all of the other inputs are also resolved, all the other problems also resolved? And I think that requires for a lot of money and a lot of finances to be set aside in order to create this city. But for the longest time, Nilesh, I think the way in which the city has been created has been always kind of this vision of the vertical city and the world-class city, but not really looking at what is under the city, which is what helps the city function. So you've had a lot of money going into things that are above ground, but much less interest in what happens below ground. And I think a lot of corruption and other problems also. So we've inherited a lot of problems that require massive amounts of structural change and massive amounts of support that we will need in the future to be able to reimagine the city.
Now, how long is this project? In the sense, how much time will elapse before we see some tangible progress? And I know that you have so much to fix behind the scenes, from the trash that's thrown in, that ends up in the Beira, the sewage lines, so many things to fix. But is there a time plan on this?
I think we're trying to resolve as many things as quickly as possible, but realistically, a lot of the kind of infrastructural problems will take quite some time. I think we need to be transparent and honest about what is possible and what isn't possible, because that would make for very bad politics to say things about what we can do and what we should do, and not be realistic about our timelines. I think it will take us a couple of years to be able to. Certainly, there'll be certain amounts of cleanliness that will happen much faster, but for us to be able to maintain that in the long run will require for a huge change. And I think that is something that we will have to continuously work at over the next few years.
Right. Now, let us assume that the NPP wins the city of Colombo, and I'm sure you'll be happy to assume that. What are the plans for the city? Because, it is, after all, the nation's capital, the real capital. You have the political capital somewhere else. But we need this to stand out, because at the moment it's any old city in Asia, isn't it? It doesn't really have a claim to fame. So what is it that you're trying to transform Colombo into? That people will point to Colombo and say, that's Colombo.
I think as NPP, over the last 2 years, as much as we've been formulating national policy, for us it's also been important to look at Colombo city, but also not Colombo city as only the city, but in order to resolve a lot of the issues that the city has, we needed to expand and also look at the district, because in terms of land resources, water resources, infrastructural resources, we would have to work with the district. So we worked on a fairly interesting group came together to be able to put together a policy for us that we worked on, that looked at different projects, that included Beira, it included Bolgoda, it included multiple Kalni River, it included multiple kind of ideas that we wanted to be able to take forward. So I think that's something that we've been really focused on. But at the same time, that's looking at the district. The city itself has some very particular needs. And I think if you're looking at, in particular, this is a very dense city. We have, I think, nearly 600,000 people who live in the city, close to 1 million people who come into the city on a daily basis. And so you have a very dense population in the city. So one of the problems, one of the larger problems we have is obviously we're limited with land space. What do we do housing becomes a massive issue. But also, I think the response to housing, and for the last so many years in the way in which leaders have looked at the city has been, and I know previously also, the previous governments have always looked at the city as a place, the commercial value for land is high. So to ensure that people within the city would leave to the peripheries and allow for the city to have how would you put this? Well, would allow for the city to have more developmental projects because that's income generating. But I think we need to have a fair mix. We need to look at housing as being a human thing as opposed to just looking at numbers. And I think that is where we have traditionally gone wrong. And you look at housing in other parts of the world that have also followed kind of a G+14 or ground +14, 15 floor, vertical high rises, and the kinds of lives that those people live as a result of those changes, I think has always proven to be extremely dangerous and wrong. So I think we have a lot to learn. We have a lot that we need to rethink. And if we are going vertical, because of how much land space we have, we need to be looking at things like micro-cities. And I know this is a fairly new concept for us to work with, but how are we looking at micro-cities that might have all of these, encapsulate all of the needs of people, but can still be vertical, but still have people have the right amount of space, have people still have the right access to resources, schools, religious places. So this requires for a fairly large reimagining of the city. Housing is one problem. Infrastructural issues. We're still dealing with pipelines that were laid 150 years ago. The CMC or any of the engineers or anyone who works in the CMC will tell you, because they certainly know this subject a lot better than I do, that whatever we inherit is going to be an extremely feeble structure, right? And that's what we have. And so to do any kind of larger projects will require us to stabilize that infrastructure. And I think that is a massive issue for us in the city. So I'm still listing out the issues we have. I mean, that's looking at, and waste management we know is again a massive issue for the city, not something that the city can manage alone. So you have all of these kinds of problems, but then you also have this huge gamut and array of social problems, right? That are interconnected with things like literacy rates. Central Colombo has one of the lowest literacy rates because a lot of children are dropping out of school. Also because of poverty, because of it's interconnected then with drug problems. So you have a city that has layers of issues. So for us as a government and now as a party that's looking to take power of local government, I think these are things that we are very cognizant of. We want this to change. But I think it requires for us as a party and as a government to put people first. Whatever we want to do in the city, if I were to give you a very concise answer, which I certainly haven't, I've given you a very long answer. But the party and the government have to consistently put the people first. If we put the people first, we will have the city that we have imagined.
Now, the Rajapaksa government focused on that particular area, port city, the area around the Golf Face Green. You see these massive high rises there, which have come up now, and that was to be the center of the city, and is the center of the city. What are the NPP's plans in respect of that particular commercial space, port city, which is right next to it, which is all interconnected?
I think that is something that we are looking at, and we are negotiating about what our involvement will be with the space. We certainly want to be able to, it is again a space that we will inherit in many ways, not necessarily something that we imagined as a government, or in some sense even the people of this country would have imagined. So I think therein lies many challenges. But there is a certain infrastructure that has already been built, businesses that are already running, and I think we need to figure out how best to take that forward.
Right. Now, let's talk about the traffic plan in Colombo, which is, it's a nightmare. There's actually no plan for the traffic, and one of the main issues I see is that we still rely on private cars and vans rather than public transport. And public transport is one of the most neglected areas of this country, both the railway system and the bus services. Now, from time to time, we have had these ideas and projects of light rail systems and so on. What's the plan for public transport, which obviously centers on the city of Colombo, but also extends out to the greater Colombo region, because, as you said, about 1 million people travel into the city every day?
Sure, I think you hit the nail on the head, because every time we talk of traffic, people always assume that it's mismanaged, but I think it's a much larger problem. And you quite rightly said that it's also because people don't want to really engage in, if you can afford it, you don't want to use public transport, right? But if you can't, then you have
but
no
those
choice.
same people will use public transport in Singapore, in New York,
Sure.
because it's standard.
And it's much easier access. You have buses that are accessible to the elderly, to women who have children or strollers, to those with disability. It is accessible. For us, it's not accessible. The buses by design are not accessible. Routes aren't accessible. Quite often, when we go in for meetings now, or we have multiple letters sent to us because we are people's representatives, asking for bus routes that existed previously that don't now, which require people having to walk 30 minutes or 25 minutes to get to point A to be able to take the next bus, when there is or was a bus route that existed in that space. But you have all of these discrepancies, and then obviously with railway lines also. I think on a national level, we are transport being more accessible. That is something that has been a part of our policy, and I think that will help resolve multiple things. But also for the city, and I know this is something that we had worked on even in our last policy. Unfortunately, the election never happened, so we never put out that manifesto. But we were looking at certain ideas that would have worked only for the city also, in ensuring that people would be able to travel much faster in certain areas. And I think being able to do that will change a lot of the congestion in the city, because on a good day, I mean, if you're trying to get out on a good day in certain areas, you're still going to be spending 30 minutes, to get to 2.5, 3 kilometers on certain days. So I think these are things that can be changed, but also in order to really change it, we do need to look at a more holistic national level plans for the city, and then also to encourage people, like you quite rightly said, to be able to use public transport, to encourage people to bike to work, to encourage people to walk. But also these may be somewhat privileged ideas of what people can do, because a lot of people who work in the city don't necessarily live in those areas. So to be able to access things, I mean, it is something that we are gunning for, and it's something we're working towards. And hopefully that is something that people will be able to see. But again, something that will take a little bit of time. Whatever we're doing right now, I think in many ways over the next 2, 3, 4 months might be in order to ensure that there is some level of comfort. But longer term, we need to be able to deal with this crisis of transport.
Now, an interesting aspect that I can put to you is that now most cities in the world, by the time they need to look at rail transport for the city, they need to go underground because there's no land. But in Colombo, there's so much railway land, and the railways, I believe there are 10 railway stations within Colombo city itself. So the tracks are there, the land for it, and so it's a matter of reworking it and then getting it modernized.
I think there's also, in some ways, in the past, not a lot of connection between these various entities and ministries in particular, looking at transport being connected to the city, being connected to to education. So you have all of these really crucial things that as a government that we've been given a mandate to change, right? But how many of these ministries in the past have cohesively worked together through their departments to be able to make that change? And I think this is where the NPP, the government that we now have, is able to make realistic change, because a lot of the time, for instance, we deal a lot with vendors, markets in PETA, things like that. Sometimes you go to a land, Niresh, the land can be owned by the CGR, the CTB has one section, and the maintenance of it is CMC. So it's just a really interesting way in which land has been divided. In most places that you can make decisions, you will have, or in most countries, you will have one particular area or one kind of line of things that is given to one department. But in Colombo, it isn't. I've noticed also with local government, quite often people come and they'll ask the CMC, can you clean this drain? Can you do this? But that doesn't belong to the CMC, that belongs to the SLRDC. But we don't, as regular folk, also engage enough to know that the city is in many ways divided by different departments.
But that's one of the conundrums.
It certainly is.
And it's there everywhere in the country.
Niresh, it makes for very difficult policy making and very difficult solution, to be able to find solutions, because then you need not just one, but multiple stakeholders to come together to make one decision about one waterway, one nalamarge, one road, one community has one problem, but the lights are with the UDA, the road is with the CMC, the drain is with the SLRDC. So you need all of these different entities to come together to make one decision. It's mind-boggling. And I know that those are the kinds of changes that we may need to take some time. Sometimes there are areas that nobody knows who owns it. Right? There are these, it is very much administrative issues, but these are not just administration if they're affecting people's lives, right?
They are rather silly issues which are critical, have become critical because it's all tied up in knots, isn't it?
It's a lot of, I think, over time, red tape, bureaucracy, corruption, and sometimes just not being able to demarcate because there are so many overlaps. And I think these are the kinds of tiny, tiny knots we're going to have to untie in order to clear it. There's no other way. It's a very, very bumpy space right now. So I would think that these are all a part of the larger scheme of things that we have. We have, again, very, I think we understand the problems, but we also know that people are going to have to be a little patient with us till we find solutions to some of this, transport being one of them.
We are in conversation with Vraie Balthazaar of the NPP, of course. We'll take a short commercial break now and we'll be right back, so don't go away.
For the first time in Sri Lanka, MIM, in collaboration with the University of Wolverhampton, offers 2 world-class master's degree programs: MA Film and Television Production, MSc Digital Marketing Management. Call now on 076 882 2707.
लाला संभल के, हर तरफ खतरा है।
देख के भाई, एक गलती और गेम ओवर।
Can you do this, Hardik? ये चैंपियंस का गेम है. It's all on the line.
Hey, the president is here.
Competition, मजा आएगा.
This is the ICC Champions Trophy.
From 19th onwards, watch live on TV1.
මේ වසන්තේ මේ ආරාධනය විසේකාර දඟකාර හැඩකාර කුමාරයන්ට සහ කෝල කොමල මනලෝල කුමාරියන්ටයි මේ වසන්තේ සිරස වසන්ත කුමරා සහ කුමරිය ලෙස කිරුළු පළදින්න දැන්ම සැරසෙන්න වයස අවුරුදු 18ත් 25ත් අතර කුමාරයන් සහ කුමාරියන් මෑතකදී ගත් ඡායාරූපයක් සමග පෙබරවාරි 20 වෙනිදාට පෙර අයදුම් කරන්න. ලිපිනය නිෂ්පාදක සිරස වසන්ත කුමරා සහ කුමරිය ස්ටයින් ස්ටුඩියෝ බොරුපන පාර රත්මලාන. පිවිසෙන්න awurudu.sirasatv.lk.
Welcome back to Face to Face. We are with Vraie Balthazaar of the NPP. And Vraie, let's get to one of your favorite topics, which is the situation of women in this country. And you are a person who gained quite a reputation for championing women's causes over the past several years. Now, I know that the NPP was very happy at getting 20 female MPs into Parliament, and the other parties collectively have 2, but that's still less than 10%, which is nothing to write home about. Now, in my opinion, although it's much better than the less than 5% we had earlier. Right, now, with the local government elections, there is a mandatory 25%, at least on paper. Is this going to be a game-changing election where women are concerned?
Okay, you're right. It is a topic that I quite like talking about, simply because I think back in the day I would write things about this, and now that it's my lived experience also about women and how we engage in the political space. So Parliament, just to start off there, there is no quota for for women in parliament. As political parties, I think as the NPP, we really did try to ensure that we had every district would have a minimum of one candidate, not in a tokenistic way, but we were very, very determined to try to ensure. In Colombo district, there were 5 of us who ran from the city. 2 of us didn't get in. So Harini, Kaushalya and Saman Mali got in, and Charmini and I didn't. We had large numbers of votes, but we didn't. And I'm only explaining this to say that sometimes you have women on the list who are capable. I'm not talking about myself per se, but there are. But also voters engage differently in different spaces. And we are women, for the better part, who are very supported in our electoral campaigns. We are not shunned away or given less importance, right? So despite all of this, sometimes you don't make the list. Were we happy? You use the term happy with the 20, and you're right. It, although historic, it is something that we wish we can do much better with. But I also understand, as a party, we understand that in order for change to happen, Niresh, in order for women to engage in the political spaces, it requires, for, as we've always said, for real, for change, for women to also understand their role in the political space, and for parties to be able to absorb that. So I'm still talking about parliamentary politics, but I think in some sense, this 10% is historic. This 10% isn't somebody's somebody, and therefore you are, it's not a nepotistic 10% for the better part. There are a couple, but not from our party. And I think that to have that representation in parliament, to have women who aren't on the list because they are somebody's somebody, and for them to be in places of power, I think that is historic. Would we like more than 20 seats? Certainly. But we also understand that perhaps in the next round, it'll be different, which is why now I'm going to connect this to local government. So 2018 was the first time local government had affirmative action. It had a 25% quota. When women got in on that first round, parties, I think, were scrambling to find women to fill those lists, right? So you were somebody's daughter, somebody's wife, somebody's mother, somebody, and you were on that list. So it wasn't enough that you were somebody. You also then, I mean, I'm not saying this is a generalization, but for the better part, this is how a lot of the women made it to the list. There were women also who had traditionally worked in party politics who also made it to the list. So then you get into local government. What then? Right? So you contest, you're on a list, you contest, you win. Which is why I think in the last maybe 6-7 years, multiple organizations, I myself, even prior to joining the NPP, would have been to multiple kind of women in politics training programs, leadership programs, skill and capacity building programs, because you had women who were in local government, but who weren't given, certainly by those parties, the capacity and the know-how to be able to exist in extremely patriarchal structure, which are local government bodies, right? These entities. So I think this is going to be a challenge going forward also. Not so much for the NPP, because certainly these are problems that we understand, things that we want change. And for us to fill in these new lists with names of women candidates isn't very difficult. Why? Because we have created our women's councils, our Kanta Sabhas, we've created our Kottash Sabhas, our people's councils, our citizens' councils, and we've been working and engaging with women, encouraging leadership, encouraging women to step up to, and in order to, when we use the term step up, I think also to understand that women's lived experience, their lives we live in a South Asian country, there are expectations that women adhere to, be it, family and, what it is, be a good daughter or a good mother, a lot of this goodness that is required to be a woman in Sri Lanka, right? So very rarely will you have someone who doesn't fit that mold, who's engaging in politics. So what does it mean for a woman from the city? And we have multiple of these on our list, on our candidates, so women who work with me, alongside me. They have care work at home, they have children, they have husbands, they have pets, they have work, they have businesses, and we still want them to engage in politics. But how do we, as a party, ensure that their lives, their problems, their economic needs are met? And I think this as a party is something that, this is where we differ, I think, to everyone else, is because this is something that we are committed to trying to do. But I don't think, and I genuinely don't believe that the other parties are doing that. So you will have candidates from the NPP who, I think, once they're in local government, we will try to resolve these issues. But I say this very openly, I feel for women from other parties who are not as supported. It is always good to have a good opposition. It is always good to have more women who can collectively understand the importance of women's roles in politics. So it doesn't mean, despite whatever party, it would be great to have a strong body of women in places of power where we can come together to fight for one cause. But I often feel for women from other parties because there isn't that kind of support structure. So it's extremely difficult. We talk of numbers, we look at statistics, and we do these comparisons, this time to last time, how will it be? But if you're looking at engaging in women in politics, and this is a huge learning curve for the NPP, for the JVP, for the government, how do we engage women? How do we work with their lived experiences and still move forward? And I think perhaps there will be dissertations and theses and books written on the lives of women politicians in the years to come, because there's a lot that's happening and changing.
Now, Vraie, the last set of councils, although the 25% rule was applied, you found too much nepotism, basically, which meant that many of the women who ended up on those councils weren't very active. They were simply there because they were somebody, and they just supported the party line. That was it. They weren't really working for the betterment of the community. Some of them did, but many of them were simply there, sort of a window dressing sort of way. I mean, there are many men on the councils who are exactly the same as well. But this time, you're assuming that the NPP wins a majority of councils, you will have women who are actually working for the community. What's that going to do to the community itself? Because all these male-dominated Pradesh Sabhas, for example, will suddenly have a lot of very active women working in them, and also it will be very easy for women in the community to approach these women councillors.
I mean, it's
Is this a sea change for Sri Lanka?
I genuinely think so, because I know this is something that we would have liked to see in parliamentary elections. It didn't, because of the numbers of women who obviously entered, because of the numbers of women on the list. So you go back in time, right? Because of the numbers of women that the party would have supported. The NPP, we managed, but I think local government, there is a list. It is affirmative action, which means you do get it on a quota. And to have more women, not just on the list, which is a 50% on the list you need to have, and 50% from your list that runs, but to be able to have more women. I mean, I know Sri Lanka has our learnings of the last 4-5 years, from 2018 up until the council was dissolved. But, in other countries that have big women's representation, I mean, you have the obvious ones like Rwanda and, the kind of larger conversations about how having more women in those places of power has changed how the country responds to certain things, from healthcare to education. But I think not too far away, even in India, where you have women, in particular in the South India, in Kerala and various other parts, and looking at how women's engagement in politics has enabled women's has kind of pushed forward women's rights, encouraged women to actively talk about, again, rights to education, ensuring the safety of girl children, children in general. And I think it's not to always kind of to say that women must be there in order to have children's rights and men can't manage, having these conversations. But certainly being able to have women, it's, to use a very simplistic example, I remember reading in one of a research paper that having more women in a particular council area meant that wells in the area were made a little more secure because the women who were using the wells were conscious about safety, which also then made a difference because there were more street lights because women were more conscious about how, about safety when going back home. And so these were all little, although minute, that made huge changes to women's lives, right? And their engagement in what they wanted to do. I don't know if you remember this, Niresh, but when they started, this whole electricity issue happened pre-Aragalay, or the reason that for the Aragalay to happen, the power cuts initially, when that started happening, one of the first thing they started doing was switching off lights on the main roads.
Which was a terrible decision.
Which was a terrible decision, certainly. But I don't think, in our circles, certainly, or in women's circles, we talked about it. What does that mean for a woman who's coming home at 7:30 alone in the dark? What does that mean for a man who comes home at 8:30 alone in the dark? And I think those lived experiences are entirely different. So to have women in places of power who will understand that, who will be able to...
But does it bother you that the men who took those decisions, assuming they were men, didn't even bother about this grim reality? Which is very obvious. As soon as I saw that decision in the paper, I said, well, you're just keeping all the women at home. That's it. They can't go out.
I think you will find that a lot of decisions, irrespective of being made by a man or a woman, again, generalizing, I think for us, when we talk of what we want to do as NPP, this is a feminist approach we're taking. It doesn't mean that every woman in politics will always engage with women's problems with a feminist approach. They will engage towing their party line in some instances and not necessarily looking at it from a women's perspective, because their leadership or their political space doesn't allow for them to have that perspective or allow for them to be a leader. And women's issues don't necessarily, women can talk about the economy, women can talk about transport, women don't necessarily have to only be talking about women and children, right? We've talked about this before. It's always pushed to our end of the line. You guys talk about this, we'll take care of the rest. And I think that's not set. That is not.
But again,
but local council, there's a way in which women will look at spaces and go, okay, so this would be, if we want to engage here, maybe there should be, along with this community kitchen or along with this center, maybe we should have a childcare center here also, because then the women can do this and this and this, because we need to be able to compartmentalize. And I think having women, not just women, but women who are policymakers, politicians, who come with that feminist approach to women's problems, to have a majority of women like that in local council, it's a dream that I think we would, it's something that we really need to be focusing on.
Now, you mentioned women's issues being pushed towards the women, and, you guys handle this and we'll handle the rest. But when you take women, children, and the elderly together, that's about 80% of the people. So the problems of about 80% of the population are actually falling to the women to handle, isn't it?
But with no power. So you have the expectation is there, but then also when you don't have the power to make those changes, and I think that also is a way in which the country has run for the longest time. Not affording, in the sense that it's run very poorly, not affording the dignity that women and the elderly and children deserve. And it has completely shunned the rights of all of these categories. And I think that's something that must change as NPP, as a government, that we're working towards. And some of these changes, hopefully, we will be able to tangibly see in the near future.
Now, let's get to the campaign. During the last two campaigns, you were quite visible, going door to door, meeting people. Basically, you did a lot of walking around especially these areas in Colombo, which most people don't see. These wattas inside these areas, which it's very congested. You get it in so many areas, the Matagoda, Beira, and so on and so forth. Are you going to do the same strategy this time?
For me, it's not just a campaign strategy to go to the wattas. We have nearly 1,350 wattas in the city. That's a lot of low-income settlements. A lot of people who don't feel like they're a part of policy making, who don't feel like their grievances have been met. People who have issues with this, who don't have sometimes access to water, some who don't have access to sanitation. For the better part, the majority have access to certain, at one point the terminology was underserved communities, but they're not underserved. They are being served with electricity, water, and so on. But there are massive issues that these communities deal with. And I think for me, as also because I come from a background as a researcher, and the last 6-7 years has been really looking at low-income settlements. I think for me, it was never really a campaign strategy to go into the Watta and to ask those in the Watta for their votes. But it is something that is very close to my heart, because I feel like the city belongs as much to them as anyone else. And to be able to work alongside these communities, to be able to work alongside these people in building the city for all of us, is really something that I genuinely believe in, and it's something that the party believes in. It is one of the reasons that I work with the NPP, because this is where our heart is. And so for me, not as much a campaign strategy, but a place where I feel like I belong, a place where I know communities, I know their problems, and I certainly want to work with them. As a party, we are not here just, and I keep saying this, I don't want to make grand promises about what we can do for the city without really understanding with the people how we can fix it. How I've been spending my mornings and evenings is actually working with these various government entities, from the CMC to all these other entities, engineers to different departments, also people who are kind of able to think out of the box with new technology, looking at how we can resolve some of these problems, working with the community, together at what they would also feel like would be a good solution for them. In most cases, these communities have been told that to do what, because they are also low-income settlements, that they have no right to decide for themselves, despite living in certain areas for 100, 200 years, that they have no right to the city. And that has to change. Going back to what I said earlier, this city is for its people. And all its people, not just one group of people, not just people who have the ability to live in the heart of Colombo in ways in which pleases them, but in ways in which it needs to be accessible to all. So for me, this campaign is as much about the bigger kind of plans we have for the city, with the larger, the larger developmental projects. The city will have multiple things, but it's as important to include those in the wattas. So will I be going back? I'm always there. It's where you'll find me most.
Right, Balthazaar, I'm afraid we are out of time. It's been a pleasure, and look forward to having you once again, probably during the election campaign, so don't be a stranger. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you to you at home for watching. Don't go away because the news is coming up next. Have a great evening.